The first thing I noticed wasn't the station. It was the air. The transit pod doors slid open with a soft hiss, and I froze for half a heartbeat. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing smelled wrong. But every instinct I had spent 24 years developing on Earth insisted that something was off. The air was too clean, too light, too perfectly balanced. It slipped into my lungs without resistance, carrying no dust, no humidity, no hint of machinery or fuel. It felt less like breathing and more like floating. That should have been comforting. Instead, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Comfort is dangerous. Earth teaches you that early. I stood in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds before forcing myself to move. Never linger in an entrance. Never become an easy target. Some habits aren't taught in classrooms. They're carved into your bones by the kind of world that punishes hesitation. As my boots touched the polished floor of orbital station Kesh-Chelish 7, I caught dozens of curious eyes turning toward me. Aliens from every corner of known space paused in the middle of conversations. Some stared openly. Others quietly stepped aside. At the time, I assumed they were simply curious about the new human exchange student. I would later discover they weren't watching because I was human. They were watching because every species aboard the station had already heard the same warning. Never underestimate someone raised on Earth. My name is Mara Voss. I am 22 years old. I weigh 61 kilograms on Earth, which means I weigh 61 kilograms here. Because Keth 7 runs its gravity plating at exactly 1 standard unit, the same as Earth, comfortable for everyone. I had been told this 3 times during my transit briefing, and each time I had nodded, and each time I had thought the same thing. Comfortable is not the same as familiar. The station corridor stretched ahead of me, wide enough to drive a transport vehicle through. The ceiling was 4 meters above my head. The lighting was a soft blue-white that made everything look like it had been cleaned twice and then cleaned again. Other cadets moved around me, filing out of the same transit pod, and I watched them the way I had learned to watch things that are larger and quieter than me. The Breathian cadets were the tallest. They stood nearly 2 meters with a forward lean to their posture that looked like they were always walking into a gentle wind. Their 4 upper limbs moved in smooth, careful arcs, and the sound they made when they walked was almost nothing, a soft press of foot against floor. They had evolved on a world with lower gravity than Earth, and it showed in the way they moved, like they were always slightly surprised that the floor was holding them. The Hulari were shorter, but wider, built like compressed stone, and they moved with the careful deliberation of a species that had learned early that moving too fast in enclosed spaces broke things. Their homeworld ran at 8 standard gravity. They were considered physically robust by interstellar standards. And then there was me, human Earthborn, from a continent called Europe, from a country that had once been famous for rain and was now famous for producing a disproportionate number of interstellar Defense Corps applicants. I had a standard-issue duffel bag over one shoulder, standard-issue boots on my feet, and a commission application that listed my intended specialty as field operations, which was the polite way of saying I wanted to be the person who goes in first. I did not look remarkable. I knew this. I was average height for a human female with the kind of build that comes from years of practical training rather than aesthetic effort. My hair was brown and cut short enough to stay out of my eyes. My eyes were gray, which people sometimes commented on, and which I had never found particularly interesting. I looked, in the grand interstellar scheme of things, like nothing worth studying. This was about to change. The processing bay was enormous. It smelled of metal and recycled oxygen and something faintly biological that I could not identify, which meant it was probably Vithion in origin, since their biology produced compounds that did not match any human reference. I stood in line with the other cadets and watched the station staff move through us with their instruments and their clipboards and their careful professional expressions. The xenobiology officer reached me third. She was Rethian, which I had expected from the roster I had memorized on the transit. Her name was Dr. Sevthal, and she had published 14 papers on human physiological response to extraterrestrial environments, which I had also read because I believe in knowing who is about to measure you. She was tall, she was quiet, and her compound eyes moved across me with an expression that I had learned to recognize in people who study things for a living. It was the expression of someone who already knows what they expect to find. She ran her scanner along my arm first, then my chest, then held it near my throat for a moment longer than the standard protocol required. I waited. She looked at her results. She looked at me. She looked at her results again. "Your resting heart rate is 62 beats per minute," she said. Her standard was very precise, with the slight over-articulation that comes from learning a language later in life rather than absorbing it as a child. "Yes," I said. "That is within normal human range." "Yes," I said again. "Your cortisol baseline is elevated." I nodded. "It usually is. My body considers new environments a low-level threat until I have been in them for approximately 72 hours. It adjusts." She made a note. The note took longer than I expected. When she looked up again, something in her expression had shifted just slightly. The way a scientist's expression shifts when a data point lands outside the expected range. "You have been in space before," she said. It was not a question. 2 prior deployments, one on Luna Station, one on the Mars orbital platform, and your cortisol adjusted within 48 hours the first time, 36 the second time. Another note, longer this time. She moved to the next item on her checklist, and I stood still and let her work, and I watched the other cadets out of the corner of my eye. The Breathian ones had finished processing quickly and were gathered near the far wall, speaking to each other in low tones that did not carry. The Hulari were still in line. One of them glanced at me and then glanced away with the careful neutrality of someone who has been trained not to stare. I understood. I was from a death world. They all knew at the moment they saw my file. The term was not an insult, or at least it was not meant as one anymore. It was a classification. Earth was catalogued under the category of Class 4 environmental pressure planets, which meant high gravity relative to the interstellar average, high biological threat index, high radiation variance by latitude, and significant geological instability. It meant that the creatures who evolved there had done so under conditions that most of the known species in the Interstellar Defense Corps would not survive unassisted. It meant I was interesting in the way that a sharp rock at the bottom of a stream is interesting, worth noting, worth stepping around. Dr. Sev Dashel closed her scanner and held it at her side. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not fully read. "You are registered for the standard acclimation track," she said. 4 weeks of physiological assessment, then placement into your chosen specialty cohort. "I am also registered for the Gravity Acclimation Chamber Protocol," I said. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I counted the extended protocol. She said, "Yes, that protocol is rated for Hodari physiology. It runs for 900 hours at 2.2 standard gravity units." "I know. No human cadet has completed it." "I know that too." She looked at me again with that careful measuring stillness that I was already beginning to associate with her around us. The processing bay continued its quiet business. Cadets moved, instruments beeped. The ventilation system produced its low and steady breath. "I have filed a formal objection to your registration." She said it is on record. I read it. I said it was thorough. Something moved in her expression that I could not name. Not quite surprise. Something adjacent to it. "And you intend to proceed?" "Yes," I said. She wrote one more note, the longest one yet. Then she capped her instrument and moved to the next cadet in line, and I picked up my duffel bag and followed the orientation arrows toward my assigned quarters, and I did not look back. The corridor was wide and clean, and the gravity was exactly 1 standard unit, and my lungs moved easily, and my legs felt almost weightless. And somewhere beneath all of it, in the part of me that was still and always would be a creature from a high-pressure world, something quiet and certain settled into place. 900 hours. I had done the math before I boarded the transit. 900 hours at 2.2, 2 standard gravity, 37 half-days inside a chamber, where the air itself would weigh more, and my blood would move differently, and my spine would compress by measurable minimum. By the end of every single day, it would be by any reasonable measure the hardest thing I had ever tried to do. I had been waiting for something like it my entire life. My quarters were small and clean and smelled of new materials. I set my bag on the bed and sat beside it, and looked at the wall for a moment. Then I opened my comm and pulled up the training schedule and read it through twice. And then I closed it and lay back and looked at the ceiling. The station hummed somewhere far below in the engineering decks. Something turned and turned and turned. I thought about my father, who had put a gravity belt on me at age 9 and made me walk to school in it for a month, and who had explained very calmly that if the world was going to be heavy, I should learn to be heavier than it. I thought about the chamber, 2.2 in 2 standard units, the kind of weight that makes your vision blur at the edges for the first few days until your body learns to push more blood to your head, the kind of weight that makes each breath a deliberate act, the kind of weight that reorganizes everything you know about moving through space and reminds you precisely and constantly that you are matter, and matter has cost. I was not afraid. That was not bravado. That was not the kind of thing people say before they discover they were wrong. I was not afraid because fear in my experience is a signal, and the signal it sends is pay attention. And I was already paying attention. I had been paying attention since the moment the pod doors opened and the air came in too easy. 900 hours I closed my eyes. I was ready before the lights went out. The chamber door opened at 0600 station time on my 4th day at KEF-7, and I walked through it carrying nothing except my water supply and my comm unit, and the 2 things I had carried since birth, which were my body and the particular way my body had learned to refuse easy answers. The chamber was 12 meters wide and 8 meters tall, and lit with the flat, even light of a room designed for function rather than comfort. The floor was rubberized for grip. The walls were smooth and gray. There were 4 monitoring cameras, 1 in each corner, and a glass observation window set into the far wall at eye level. And on the other side of that window, Dr. Sethal stood with her instrument slate and her careful expression and watched me walk to the center of the room. I stood on the weight pad. I pressed my thumb to the activation panel. The display beside the door read, "Protocol initiated. Target load 2.2 standard gravity units. Estimated duration 900 hours. Cadet Vos Mara species human." Then the gravity plates engaged. It happened in steps, 0.1 standard unit at a time, with a 30-second hold between each increment, which gave the body a chance to register what was being asked of it before more was asked. I had been through gravity stress testing before on Earth and during my first deployment, so I knew what the increments felt like. I knew the way 0.8 standard felt lighter than home. I knew the way 1.2 started to ask questions of your lower back. I knew that 1.8 was the point where the Hulari began to look uncomfortable. When the display reached 2.2 and held, I stood very still and breathed. It was not pleasant. I want to be clear about that because this is not a story about a person who does not feel things. It was heavy in the way that heavy things are heavy, which is to say everywhere at once. My shoulders felt the weight of my own arms. My spine felt the weight of everything above it. My lungs felt the weight of the air itself, just slightly, just enough to remind them that expansion required effort. The blood in my legs moved more slowly, and my heart compensated, adding beats per minute in the careful arithmetic of survival. I breathed in, I breathed out. I took a step, then another. Behind the glass, Dr. Sethal wrote something on her slate. The first 100 hours are the ones I remember most clearly because they were the hours when everything was still new. New in the way that pain is new when it has not yet become familiar. My body was negotiating. It was running through its options. The way a body does when it is placed in conditions that are not quite what it evolved for, looking for the most efficient way to continue. I could feel the negotiation happening, not as thought exactly, but as a kind of distributed conversation between my muscles and my blood and the ancient mechanical wisdom of my skeleton. I spent those first 100 hours moving, walking the perimeter of the chamber, doing slow, deliberate exercises that were designed not to exhaust me, but to remind my body that it was still capable of movement, that the weight was a condition and not a verdict. I ate my meals on the chamber floor, leaning against the wall, because sitting down and getting back up at 2.2 standard was its own exercise, and I was not wasting the energy. I drank more water than I thought I needed, because gravity increases the work your kidneys do, and dehydration at this load would be a problem that started small and grew fast. Dr. Seventhal came to the observation window every 12 hours. She ran her remote scanner through the glass. She looked at her results. She looked at me. She made her notes. On the third check-in at hour 36, she spoke through the intercom. "Your heart rate has stabilized." She said, "Yes," I said. "It was elevated for the first 18 hours. That is normal." It was learning. She paused. Learning. Calibrating. I said, because I could tell the first word had landed strangely. It was finding the right rate for the load. It does that. Another pause. Longer. "You are not in distress," she said. It was not a question, but I answered it anyway. "Not currently." She wrote something on her slate and stepped back from the window, and I turned and walked the perimeter again, and the cameras watched me, and the floor pressed up against my feet with the patient firmness of a world that has decided to be honest with you. The other cadets began watching around hour 200. I did not blame them. The observation window was accessible from the corridor outside the chamber block, and the gravity acclimation section was not a hydraulic area under normal circumstances. So, the fact that there was a human inside it, doing something that had never been done before, was understandably interesting. They came in ones and twos, pressed their faces to the glass, watched me for a while, and left. Some of them I recognized from the processing bay. Some I did not. None of them stayed long. I understood what they were looking for. They were looking for the moment when it became too much. They were waiting for the signal that would confirm what they already believed, which was that the creature from the death world was in the end only a creature. And creatures have limits, and limits, when reached, look a particular way. They watched, I walked, I ate, I slept on the chamber floor with a thin mat beneath me, and the 2.2 standard weight of the world pressing me gently and consistently into it. And I woke up and walked again. Hour 212 was the first time the headache started. I had expected them earlier. They came from the sustained pressure on the cerebral spinal fluid, which had elevated gravity redistributes in ways that the brain registers as a slow, deep complaint somewhere behind the eyes. It was not sharp. It was not sudden. It was the kind of pain that installs itself so gradually that you are never quite sure when it arrived, only that it is here now, and it plans to stay. I drank more water. I adjusted my neck exercises. I spent 20 minutes lying with my feet elevated, which helped. I logged the symptom into my comm unit, because the protocol required it, and Dr. Sethel saw the log entry at her next check-in, and I watched her read it through the glass, and I watched her write a longer-than-usual note after it. She looked up from her slate and met my eyes through the window. "I can halt the protocol," she said. "I know," I said. "Your log indicates sustained cranial pressure. That is a documented risk factor for I know what it is a risk factor for." I said I read the literature before I registered. She looked at me for a moment, and I am monitoring it. The pressure is manageable. If it becomes unmanageable, I will tell you. "You will tell me," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was not quite skepticism and not quite belief. Something in the middle, the place where scientists live when the data has not yet resolved into a conclusion. "I will tell you," I said. She closed her slate. She walked away from the window. I turned back to the room and walked another perimeter. My feet were steady. My breathing was even. The headache sat behind my eyes like a tenant who had paid rent and knew it. And I accommodated it the way I accommodated everything in that room, which was by deciding it was not the most important thing. The most important thing was the next step, then the one after that, then the one after that. By hour 300, the other cadets had stopped coming to watch. Not all at once. One by one, over the course of about a week, they simply stopped appearing at the window. I noticed it without particularly thinking about it. The way you notice when background noise disappears and the silence takes on a different quality. Dr. Seva Dashthal still came every 12 hours without exception. Her check-ins had grown longer. She now stayed at the window for 15 minutes instead of 5. Her questions had changed too. Shifted from clinical to something that was harder to categorize. She asked me what I was thinking about. She asked me whether the chamber felt different at night than during the day, even though the lighting and gravity were identical around the clock. She asked me at hour 340 whether I had ever done anything like this before. I told her about the mountain, There is a mountain range in the northern part of my home continent, not especially famous by global standards, but significant enough. And when I was 16, my father had taken me to the highest accessible point and had me carry a 40 kg pack from base to summit over 4 days. The air at that altitude is thin. The cold is the kind that gets inside your clothes and makes friends with your bones. The terrain does not care about your plans or your schedule or your energy levels. It is simply there, and you are simply there too. And the conversation between you and it is conducted entirely in the language of physical reality. I had cried on the second day, not from pain exactly, but from the particular frustration of a body that is being asked for more than it wants to give and does not yet understand that it can. I had sat on a rock at 2,000 meters and cried for approximately 6 minutes, and then I had stood up and kept walking because my father was ahead of me on the trail, and he had not looked back, and I understood that not looking back was its own kind of lesson. We reached the summit on the afternoon of the 4th day. He had turned to me at the top and said, "You know where your edge is." This was useful information to carry. Dr. Sevthal listened to this story without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "And where is your edge now?" she asked. I looked at the room around me, the flat gray walls, the weight pressing through my feet into the floor. "Further out than this," I said. She did not write anything down after that. She just looked at me through the glass for a long moment, and then she turned and walked down the corridor, and I watched her go. And then I turned back to my room and kept moving. Hour 400 arrived at 0200 station time, which meant I was asleep when it passed, lying on my mat with the full weight of the enhanced gravity holding me against the floor like a very patient and very large hand. I woke at 0530, checked my comm, noted the milestone, and began my morning routine. Something had changed, though I would not have been able to say exactly when the change happened. It was not a single moment. It was more like the way a season changes, where one day you look outside and realize that the light is different, and has been different for a while, and you had simply not stopped to notice. The weight was still there, it was always there, but it had stopped being a problem I was solving, and had become instead a condition I was living in, like weather, like altitude, like the particular physics of a world that has decided to be honest with you. My body had completed its negotiations. It had found the rate that worked, the rhythm that was sustainable, the particular way of moving that cost the least and delivered the most. It had stopped arguing with the gravity and started working with it, the way water works with the shape of a riverbed, not fighting the constraint, but moving within it, with a kind of fluid economy. This is, I want to be clear, not comfortable. It was still heavy. My joints still registered it. My spine still compressed by its daily millimeters and expanded overnight when the load was lighter. The headaches came and went on their own schedule. The weight was always there, but I was no longer counting down. I was just moving forward, which is a different thing entirely. Dr. C. Dashenthal came at hour 4:12 and found me doing slow balance exercises in the center of the room. She ran her scanner. She looked at her results. She looked at me. She stayed for 40 minutes that time. She asked 17 questions. I answered all of them. When she left, she forgot to close her slate, and I could see through the window that she had written at the very bottom of her notes, in the smaller script she used for personal observations rather than clinical data, 4 words that I was not meant to read but did. I do not understand. I did not tell her I had seen it. I turned back to my exercises and kept going, because understanding was her job, and enduring was mine, and we were both in our own way doing exactly what we were built for. Hour 500, hour 600, the chamber, the weight, the window, the question of where the edge is, further, always further. The answer had not changed. At hour 603, Dr. Sevenfell stopped using her instrument slate to take notes and started using a separate journal. I noticed this the way I had started to notice everything in those weeks, which was carefully and without expression, because the chamber had done something to the way I processed information. It had stripped away the noise. There was not much to think about except the essential things. And so the essential things have become very clear, like objects seen in clean light after a long time in shadow. The journal was physical paper or something close to paper, the kind of flat synthetic material that Brethian academics preferred because the act of writing by hand engaged different cognitive processes than typing. She held it pressed against her chest as she approached the window at hour 6:03, and she had her scanner in her other hand, and when she reached the glass, she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not pity. She had started with pity at the beginning, and I had watched it change over the weeks. The way weather changes slowly, and then all at once. It was not clinical detachment either, which had been her second expression, the one she wore when she was trying to remember that I was a subject, and she was an observer. And those were distinct categories with distinct responsibilities. This was something else. It was the expression of someone who has been looking at a problem from one angle for a long time and has just realized there is another angle entirely, and they are not sure what to do with that information. She ran her scanner. She read the results. She wrote in her journal. "Your pain indicators are atypical," she said through the intercom. Her voice had changed too subtly over the weeks. It had lost some of its professional smoothness and picked up something rarer underneath, like a road after a season of heavy weather. "In what way?" I asked. "They are present," she said. "The scanner confirms that you are registering pain signals consistent with sustained elevated load, joint compression, soft tissue strain, and chronic low-grade cranial pressure." She paused. "But your behavioral response to those signals is not consistent with the pain levels the scanner is measuring." I considered this. "How so?" "You are not guarding," she said. "When a body is in significant pain, it guards. It holds itself differently. It protects the areas that hurt. Your posture, your gait, your movement patterns show none of that." "I know where the pain is," I said. "I do not need to protect it. I need to move around it." She looked at me for a long moment. "Move around it," she repeated. "The pain is a signal," I said, because I had explained this to myself enough times that the words came easily. "It is telling me that something is under stress. That is useful information. It does not mean the stressed thing will break. It means I need to be aware of it." I shifted my weight slightly and felt the familiar pull in my left hip flexor that had been there since day 8. "If I guarded every place that hurt, I would not be able to move at all," she wrote in her journal. A lot she wrote for almost a full minute without looking up, and I stood in the center of the chamber and waited, because there was nothing else I needed to be doing just then. And patience is a thing the chamber had given me in generous supply. When she looked up, she asked the question she had been building toward for days. I could tell it had been coming. The earlier questions had been circling it the way a river circles an obstacle before it finally goes around. "Why?" she said. "Not why are you in pain? Not why is your physiology atypical? Just why?" I knew what she meant. "Because there is something I want," I said. "The Commission Field Command clearance, the thing that comes after 900 hours. But that is not all of it," she said. I looked at her through the glass. She was right. She had been careful and attentive and rigorous for 603 hours, and she had earned the right to the complete answer. "No," I said. "It is not all of it." I looked at the room, the gray walls, the unchanging light. "I grew up being told what I could not do," I said. "Not by people necessarily. By physics, by biology, by the accumulated weight of what the human body is supposed to be able to handle. There are limits on the charts, official limits, measured and documented and submitted to committees." I looked back at her. I have never found one that held. She was very still. Every time I have reached a point that the chart said was the end, I said the end was not there. There was just more ground, and so I kept walking. I paused. I am still walking. I will keep walking until I find the actual edge, not the one on the chart, the real one. She looked at me for a long time. Then she opened her journal and wrote something. She wrote it slowly, deliberately, with the careful script of someone putting something on record that they want to be able to find again later. She did not tell me what she wrote, but that night, lying on my mat with the weight pressing me gently into the floor and the cameras keeping their quiet watch from the corners, I thought about the look on her face when she finished writing it. And I thought it was the look of someone who has just learned something that changes the shape of several other things they thought they already understood. Hour 6:44. She asked me if I was in pain, not as a clinical question, The scanner was already done. This was something else. Yes, I said. She waited for more. I looked at her steadily. It is fine, I said. Her compound eyes held on my face for a moment that stretched. It is fine, she said. And it was not a question, and it was not agreement. It was the sound of someone repeating a sentence in a foreign language because they need to hear it in their own voice, to understand whether it makes sense. I started to tell her about my mother then because it seemed relevant. My mother was a field medic, and she had a saying that I had grown up hearing so often it had stopped being a sentence and become instead a kind of background frequency, a thing that was simply true, the way gravity is true. The saying was, "The body is not the point. The body is not the point. The body is not the point. Keep it running." I told Dr. Sabath all this. She listened with her whole body. The Vethian stillness, that was not absence of attention, but its maximum intensity. "Your mother is a medic." She said I said she died when I was 12. Industrial accident. She kept working for 4 hours after the injury before she let anyone help her, because there were still people who needed the help more. I said it plainly, because it was plain. It was the most human thing I knew how to describe. My mother in a burning structure with a broken arm continuing to do the work, because the work was the point and the arm was just the vehicle. Dr. Sethal did not say she was sorry. I was glad of that. Instead, she looked at me with that new expression, the one that had replaced pity and detachment and was still finding its name. And she wrote in her journal. I did not see what she wrote that time, but I saw her hand moving on the page, and it moved for a long time. An hour 700. My sleep schedule had settled into a precise rhythm. 6 hours on, 2 hours up, 4 hours on. It was not what I had planned, but it was what my body had negotiated for itself. And I had learned by then that my body's negotiations were worth respecting. The shorter sleep cycles kept me from going too deep, which at this load would mean waking up stiff in ways that took too long to resolve. I had stopped counting hours consciously, somewhere around 650. The number on my comm was still there, but it had stopped being a source of information and become more like a landmark. I was past it. I was moving. The number told me where I had been, not where I was going. The Verthian cadets had long since completed their training tracks and moved into their specialty rotations. I knew this from Dr. Saval, who mentioned it at a check-in without apparent affect, but who I suspected had mentioned it deliberately. The Hulari cadet who had glanced at me in the processing bay, whose name I had looked up and found to be Gareth, though, had completed the standard acclimation track in 3 weeks and was now in advanced tactical training. The chamber was mine alone. It had always been mine alone, but now it felt earned in a way it had not at the start. The room had become over the weeks a thing I understood. Every scuff on the floor, see exact sound the ventilation system made when it cycled. The way the lighting shifted by a fraction of a degree in warmth between station day and station night. I had spent more continuous time in this room than I had spent in any single place since leaving Earth. And it had the quality of a thing that has decided to accept you. Went hour 7:12. She came to the window at an unusual time, not the standard 12-hour interval. Station time was 21:40, which meant she had come on her own schedule, not the protocols. She stood at the glass for a moment without activating the intercom. I was sitting against the wall eating, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and neither of us moved. Then she pressed the intercom button. "Why are you not stopping?" She said it was different from the earlier why. The earlier one had been clinical, a question with a data-shaped space where the answer was supposed to fit. This one was something else. This one had the quality of a question that has been sitting in someone for a while, growing heavier until it finally has to be said out loud. I set down my food. Stopping would hurt more than continuing, I said. She was quiet. If I stop now, I said, I will know that I stopped. I will know exactly where I stopped and why. And that number, that hour, that moment will become my limit. It will be recorded. I looked at the wall across from me, not in the protocol log in me, in the part that makes decisions about what I will try next time. I looked back at her. If I do not stop, there is no limit recorded. There is only the work, and the work continuing, and at the end, the thing the work was for. She looked at me through the glass for a long moment. You have decided, she said slowly, that the limit does not exist until you have actually reached it. Yes. And reaching it would require something I have not encountered yet, I said. She looked down at her journal, then up at me. Does it not concern you, she said carefully, that by the time you reach an actual limit, it might be too late too? It concerns me as much as any other risk concerns me, I said. Which is to say, I have thought about it, assessed it, and decided the outcome I am working toward is worth the probability of the risk. She was quiet for a long time. The corridor behind her was empty. The station had settled into its night mode. Quieter, dimmer at the edges, the hum of the systems a little lower. That is a very human answer, she said, not as a compliment, not as criticism, as an observation, the kind that lands like a fact, being placed carefully on a table for examination. Yes, I said. I know. She looked at her journal. I have been taking notes on you for 712 hours, she said. I know. I was trained to observe, to record, to analyze, to produce conclusions that are defensible and reproducible. Yes. She looked up from the journal at me through the glass. I am having difficulty, she said quietly, producing conclusions. I looked at her, the careful stillness of her, the compound eyes that saw more wavelengths than mine, and were still apparently having trouble seeing clearly enough. What does that feel like? I asked. I was genuinely curious. She had been kind to me in her way, and I found I wanted to understand her as much as she wanted to understand me. She thought about the question for a moment. It feels, she said, like trying to measure something with a tool that was built for a different kind of measurement. I nodded. I understood that I had felt it with the gravity in the beginning before my body had recalibrated the mismatch between the system and the thing being asked of it. Your tool is good. I said you are a very good scientist. The tool is not the problem. She waited. The problem, I said, is that what you are measuring is not what you thought you were measuring. She looked at me for a long time. Then she wrote in her journal slowly and deliberately, and she held the pen still when she finished, and she looked at the page, and then she looked at me, and something in her expression had shifted into a place it had not been before, and she did not say what she had written. She nodded once to me and turned and walked back down the corridor. I finished my meal in the quiet of the chamber. Hour 800 arrived while I was asleep, and when I woke up and checked my comm and saw the number, I lay on my mat for a moment and looked at the ceiling. 100 hours left. I thought about the mountain the second day, the rock at 2,000 meters and the 6 minutes of crying, and the getting up after. I thought about my father's back ahead of me on the trail, the pack he was carrying, the deliberate way he did not look back. I got up. I began my morning routine. The weight was there. It was always there. It was a fact of this place, not a punishment. I moved through it the way I had learned to move through it, with the economy of something that has stopped fighting its environment and started living in it. 100 hours. I walked my perimeter. It began with a number that had been in the xenobiology literature for 11 years, and that Dr. Sevthal had cited 3 times in her own published work, which was this. The maximum documented sustained load for a human subject outside of emergency survival conditions was 1.9 standard gravity units maintained for a period not exceeding 200 hours, with significant physiological recovery time required afterward. She had always cited it as a ceiling, a limit, the top of the range, the kind of number that a responsible researcher treats as a boundary and designs their protocols around. She was sitting in her office at hour 8:47, reading that paper for the 4th time in 2 weeks. And she was doing the thing she had been doing since approximately hour 600, which was noticing all the things it did not say. It did not say that the limit was absolute. It said that it was documented, which was a different thing entirely. Documentation is a record of what has been attempted and measured. It is not a map of what is possible. She had known this in theory for her entire career. It is the kind of thing that scientists know and write into the introductions of their papers and then quietly forget while they are working, because the known is comfortable and the unknown requires a different kind of attention. Morales had been at 2.2 standard gravity units for 847 hours, not 1.9, not for 200 hours with recovery time, 2.22 for 847 hours, and she was still walking her perimeter. Dr. Sethel pulled up the full data archive she had built over the past 5 weeks. It was substantial. It was the most detailed physiological record of a human being and sustained elevated gravity that had ever been compiled by a significant margin, because nothing like this had ever been attempted before. The data was clean and consistent and reproducible, which meant it was by the definition her training had given her scientific fact. The facts were as follows. Maravos's cardiovascular system had adapted within the first 100 hours to efficiently circulate blood against a load that exceeded the recommended maximum by 15%. It had done this without pharmacological assistance, without mechanical support, without any intervention at all. It had simply decided to work differently, and then work differently, and the scanner records showed the adaptation clearly in the gradual normalization of her heart rate. Over those first 100 hours, her skeletal system showed compression consistent with the load, but no fracture indicators, and no stress responses beyond what would be expected from ordinary heavy physical training on Earth. Her bone density, which had been slightly above human average at baseline, had remained stable. The body was treating the load as something it had encountered before, and knew how to manage. Her nervous system was the most interesting data set. Dr. Sethel had spent considerable time on this part of the archive, because the nervous system was where the most unexpected adaptation had occurred, and the most unexpected adaptation was in the pain response. Human pain signaling, she knew from the textbook she had studied as a student, was designed to protect, and pain was a warning, a loud, insistent, impossible to ignore warning that something was wrong and needed to be addressed. It was not designed to be overridden. It was not designed to be managed. It was designed to be obeyed. Maravos did not obey it. And the interesting thing, the thing that had kept Dr. Sevthal awake for 3 nights running, was that she was not suppressing it either. She was not using any technique that shut the signal down, or numbed it, or convinced her nervous system it was not happening. The pain signals were present in every scan, consistent and real, firing in the expected locations at the expected intensities. She was hearing them. She was simply filing them differently. There was no medical literature for this. She had searched the human medical literature, and the cross-species literature, and the edge case xenobiology databases that most researchers never looked at because they were full of single-instance data points with insufficient sample sizes to be generalized. She had found individual accounts here and there of human beings in extraordinary circumstances who had continued to function through injuries and conditions that should have been incapacitating, that were documented as incapacitating for other species. The accounts were there. They were just not systematized. Nobody had looked at them as a pattern. She was looking at them now. She put the open medical journal on her desk and put her archive data next to it and looked at them together side by side, the individual accounts, and the 5 weeks of careful measurement from the chamber, and she saw what she had been failing to see, because she had been looking at each piece of data separately, instead of looking at all of it at once. This was not an anomaly. Maravos was not an exception. Maravos was the data point that made the pattern visible, the specific and individual instance of something that was not specific and individual at all. She had simply been the one to volunteer for 900 hours at 2.2 standard gravity, which had given Dr. Sethal 5 weeks to watch her and measure her and slowly, reluctantly accumulate evidence that everything she had assumed about the ceiling of human endurance was based on a sample size that was radically too small. She opened the full human physiological database, not the abbreviated version, and she normally referenced, but the complete archive that ran to hundreds of volumes and covered 300 years of Earth-based research. She had access to it through the Core Research Network, and she had consulted it many times, but always for specific questions, always looking for the data point she needed to confirm something she was already working toward. She started reading differently this time. She read the way Maravos moved through the chamber methodically, completely, without deciding in advance what she was looking for. It took her most of the night. By the time the station lighting shifted into its morning cycle, she had read through accounts of childbirth. She had read through the compiled data on long-distance endurance events, the ones that lasted multiple days that required participants to continue moving through sleep deprivation and extreme physical depletion and conditions that the body registers as crisis, but that humans in sufficient numbers and with sufficient motivation simply continue through. She had read the historical accounts that she had previously classified as anecdotal. Soldiers who had completed operations with undiscovered fractures, workers who had continued their shifts through what were later determined to have been heart events. An account from 200 years ago on a mountain even higher than the one Mara had described, of a person who had descended with severely impaired motor function and no supplemental oxygen and had simply refused to stop. She had read about the immune system, the human immune system which fought on 17 fronts simultaneously, which lost constantly and adapted constantly and restarted constantly, which had been running at full operational capacity in every human body for every minute of every day since birth, which meant that every human being was at this moment engaged in a biological conflict that would have incapacitated most other species, and which they simply accommodated as the normal background of existing. She put down the journal she had been writing in, which was now mostly full. She opened a new one. At the top of the first page she wrote, "What I have been assuming is that Mara Voss is an outlier. She is not an outlier. She is the median of something I have not been measuring correctly." She sat with that for a moment. Then she kept writing because there was more. The more was this. She had spent 11 years studying alien biology. She had published 14 papers. She had 3 research awards and a citation from the Interstellar Science Foundation, and a reputation among her colleagues as someone who was careful, thorough, and appropriately conservative in her conclusions. She had done all of this work with the assumption that she was approaching her subjects from a position of scientific neutrality, that she was measuring them without preconception, that her data was clean because she had been scrupulous about her methodology. She had not been clean. She had been looking at Maravos and before Maravos at the limited literature on humans in elevated gravity environments, and before that at the general xenobiology of Earth origin life, and she had been looking at it through a lens she had not known she was wearing. The lens was this. She had been looking for limits. She had been doing science designed to find the ceiling, and so everything she had found had confirmed the ceiling because she had been selecting for data that pointed at it. She had not been asking what happens when the ceiling does not exist. She was asking it now. The chamber had asked it for her over 847 hours, patiently and without agenda, simply by containing a human being who had declined to stop. She thought about the things Mara had told her, about her father and the mountain, about her mother who had kept working for 4 hours on a broken arm because the work was not finished, about the way Mara had described the pain response, not as something to fight or endure, but as information, data, a signal to be received and processed and factored into the next decision without being allowed to become the final decision. The body is not the point. The body is the vehicle. Keep it running. She thought about what a species was in the biological sense. A species was the accumulated wisdom of every environment that had ever tried to kill its ancestors and failed. A species was the record of every pressure it had ever adapted to. Written in the language of bone density and cardiovascular efficiency, and immune response, and 1,000 other parameters that she could scan and measure and record. Earth was a Class 4 environmental pressure planet. Gishi had known this. She had cited it in papers. She had used it to contextualize the humans she had studied, to explain why they had the bone density and the cortisol profiles and the immune complexity that they did. She had not followed the logic all the way to its end. All the way to its end, it meant this. Every human being alive was the descendant of organisms that had survived across millions of years on a world that was actively attempting to eliminate them. The gravity, the radiation, the cold and the heat, and the biological competition and the microbial warfare conducted inside every body at every moment. They had not just survived it, they had adapted to it so completely that they no longer perceived it as extraordinary. They perceived it as home. And then she had put one of them in a room with 2.2 standard gravity for 847 hours and watched her walk around in it and had expected her to break. The error was not in the methodology. The methodology was impeccable. The error was in what she had been measuring. She had been measuring a human being against the standards developed for species from gentler worlds, species whose evolutionary history was a record of comfort rather than pressure. And she had been surprised when the human being did not fit those standards. She should not have been surprised. She had all the data. She had had all the data for 11 years. She had simply never put it together into the shape that would have told her what it meant. She looked at the journal. She looked at the data archive on her screen. She looked at the time, which told her that in 53 hours and change, the gravity protocol would complete, and Maravos would walk out of that chamber, and the 900 hours would be on record, and the commission would be issued, and Maravos would go on to do whatever it was she planned to do next. And Dr. Saval would have a very large archive and a very full journal, and a very changed understanding of something she had thought she already understood. She opened the final section of her research notes. At the top, in the careful script she used for conclusions, she wrote, "The question I was asked to answer was whether a human being could complete the 900-hour protocol. The question I should have been asking is why I ever thought the answer might be no." She closed the notes. She sat in her office in the quiet of the station's morning, with the data around her, and the journal in front of her, and the changed shape of several things she had previously considered settled. And she looked at the ceiling and breathed. 53 hours. She had a great deal to think about. The chamber door opened at 0600 and I walked out. I had been tracking the final hours differently from the ones before them, which is to say I had not been tracking them at all. Somewhere in the last 2 days, the counting had stopped feeling useful. The work was almost done. The number on the comm would change when it changed, and I would walk out when I walked out, and the walking out would mean what it meant. And none of that required me to watch the clock. So, I had not watched the clock. I had slept my 6 and 4. I had eaten my meals. I had walked my perimeter. I had done my slow, deliberate exercises and drunk my water and let the headache that lived behind my left eye do its thing. And I had been present in the chamber the way I had been present for all 900 hours, which was completely and without reservation. And then the display beside the door changed to protocol complete, and the gravity plates eased down increment by increment, a tenth of a standard unit at a time. And I stood in the center of the room and felt each reduction, the way you feel a burden being taken, not all at once but piece by piece. The weight lifting in stages until the display read 1.0 standard, and the room was Earth weight. And then the door opened. One standard unit felt like nothing. It felt like being held by something with gentle hands, like the world had decided to be kind. I stood in the doorway for a moment, with one foot in the chamber and one foot in the corridor, and I felt the weight of my own arms, and found it charming, almost how little effort it cost to hold them up. I stepped through. The corridor was the standard temperature, the standard humidity, the standard blue-white light. It looked exactly as it had looked on the day I arrived, which was 4 days after my arrival, which was the day I had entered the chamber, and I had not seen it in 37.5 days. Dr. Sivithal was standing 6 meters away. She was not holding her instrument slate. She was not holding her journal. Her hands were at her sides, and she was looking at me with the expression that had been building across all 900 hours. The one that had replaced pity, and then clinical interest, and then something I had not quite been able to name through the glass. And seeing it now without the glass between us, I could name it clearly. It was awe. Quiet awe. The kind that does not perform itself. The kind that sits in a person and changes the shape of the room. I walked toward her. My gait was normal, which surprised me slightly in a pleased way, because I had expected some recalibration time, and apparently my body had already done the recalibration quietly and without drama while I was sleeping through the last 6-hour cycle. I stopped a meter from her. She looked at me for a moment. "Does it hurt?" she said. "Not does your cardiovascular system show elevated strain. Not are your cortisol levels within acceptable post-protocol parameters. Just does it hurt?" "Everything hurts," I said. "It is fine," she nodded. The nod was slow and small, the kind that means I expected that, and I am still processing it. The medical team arrived and escorted me to the infirmary. Dr. Seventhal did not come with them. I looked back once as they turned me down the corridor, and she was still standing where I had left her, looking at the chamber door, which had closed behind me. The infirmary was bright and warm, and the doctors were efficient and pleasant and not particularly surprised by what they found, which was a body that had been under significant stress for 37.5 days and had managed that stress in the competent, unglamorous way of a system that had evolved for exactly this kind of situation. No stress fractures, cardiac function within acceptable deviation, cortisol elevated but stable, muscle fiber breakdown consistent with heavy but survivable sustained load, bone density unchanged. The chief medical officer, a Hulari named Grant, who had short gray hair and the kind of face that has seen a lot of things and reached a kind of settled peace with most of them, reviewed the results and said, "You are in remarkable condition, cadet. Thank you." I said I want to be clear that remarkable is a relative term. He said, "You are not in the condition of someone who has had an easy 37 days. I know, I said, but you are in the condition of someone who is going to be fine." "Yes," I said, "I know that too." He looked at me over his instrument. Then he looked at his results. Then he looked at me again. "I have a lot of questions." He said, "Dr. Sevthal has an archive." I said she kept very thorough records. "Yes," he said, "she sent them to me this morning. All of them." He looked at the last page of the results. "It will take me some time to read through," he said. "Take whatever time you need," I said. He cleared me for general quarters. I signed the protocol completion form. I accepted the temporary commission certification that would be replaced with a permanent one within 48 hours. I shook Grant's hand, which was a very large hand, and I found that shaking it was easy, and that my grip was, if anything, a bit stronger than it had been before. I walked back to my quarters. The corridor was the standard width. The ceiling was 4 meters up. The other cadets moved past me, and some of them recognized me, and some did not. And the ones who recognized me looked at me with varying versions of an expression I had come to understand was a human response to someone doing something the observer cannot categorize. My quarters were exactly as I had left them, small and clean, and smelling of new materials. The bed was made, which meant the station staff had serviced it during my absence, and the surface of it looked very soft, and very flat, and very appealing. I sat on the edge. I looked at the wall for a moment. I thought about my father, and about my mother, and about the mountain, and about 37.5 days in a room that weighed more than it looked. Then I lay back and I let the standard 1-unit gravity hold me, and it was gentle, and I slept for 14 hours without a single interruption, and I did not dream of anything heavy. Dr. Sethel's office was on the research level 3 decks up from the chamber block, and she had been in it since 0400. She had gone to see Mara walk out of the chamber. She had stood in the corridor and watched the door open and watched Mara step through, and had felt the thing she had been building toward for 900 hours arrive in her chest, with the quiet certainty of a conclusion that has finally run out of reasons to wait. Then she had gone back to her office. The resignation form had been on her desk for 6 days. She had drafted it at hour 8:44 in the quiet of a late station night, not in anger and not in defeat, and not in any of the emotional registers she would have expected resignation to come in. She had drafted it with the focused calm of someone who has reached the end of a line of reasoning and is simply writing down where the line ends. The line ended here. She was a xenobiologist. She had spent 11 years studying what alien life was capable of, which was to say, she had spent 11 years asking the question, what is possible and for whom? It was a question with a direction. You asked it, and you went in that direction, and you found what was at the end. What was at the end in this case was Maraus, walking out of a chamber after 900 hours, and saying everything hurts, and it is fine, and meaning it and being right. One Shalusthal was a very good scientist. She believed in her methods. She believed in her training. She believed in the value of systematic observation and careful documentation and the slow, patient accumulation of evidence toward conclusions that were defensible and reproducible. She still believed all of that. She also believed that she had reached the boundary of what her particular set of instruments could measure, not because the instruments were wrong, because the thing she had been measuring was larger than the frame she had built around it. She had spent 5 weeks measuring a human being. She now understood that she had actually been measuring something considerably bigger, which was the record of what Earth had done to the species that evolved on it, written in bone density and pain response, and the particular way a body learns to reorganize itself around a challenge instead of submitting to it. She could not measure that with what she had. She was not sure anyone could measure that with anything currently available, and she was not sure if she was being honest, which she had always valued being, that she was the right kind of scientist for the attempt. The science she had been trained to do had a particular shape, and the thing she had encountered in the chamber over 900 hours had a different shape, and she did not know how to hold both shapes at once without losing the integrity of either. So, she had written the resignation, and she had let it sit for 6 days, because she was thorough and because she did not make significant decisions in the first wave of feeling. She had let it sit, and she had continued her check-ins, and she had continued her notes, and she had watched Mara walk her perimeter and eat her meals, and sleep her 6 and 4, and answer her questions with the quiet, direct patience of someone who is not performing anything but simply is what she is, and the resignation had not changed. She picked it up now. She read it through one final time. It was 3 paragraphs, which was longer than strictly necessary for the purpose, but shorter than the situation deserved. And the language was careful and exact, and said what she meant, which was that she was stepping back from active xenobiological assessment because she had reached the edge of her methodological competence, and she believed it was better to acknowledge that clearly than to continue producing data that she was no longer certain she was interpreting correctly. She did not write about Mara in the resignation that felt like it belonged somewhere else. It belonged in the archive she had built, and in the 2 journals she had filled, and in the paper she intended to write eventually, when she had enough distance to see the whole shape of what she had learned. She signed the resignation. She placed it in the outgoing document queue. She sat back in her chair. The station hummed around her, the deep and patient hum of a structure that had been doing this for a long time and expected to continue. Outside the research-level windows, the gas giant that Keth 7 orbited rolled in its ancient pattern, enormous and unhurried, its atmosphere moving in bands of color that she had always found beautiful without ever finding the right words for them. She opened her journal, the second one, the one she had started at hour 8:47. She turned to the last page that had writing on it and read what she had written, which was, "The question I was asked to answer was whether a human being could complete the 900-hour protocol. The question I should have been asking is why I ever thought the answer might be no." She looked at that for a long time. Then she turned to the next blank page and wrote one more thing. She wrote, "I have been a scientist for 11 years, and I have believed that the purpose of science is to find the limits of things. I am leaving this position because I have learned in a small gray room under elevated gravity that some things do not have limits in the places the instruments point." She paused. She wrote, "Maravos is 22 years old and from a planet that tried very hard to produce something that could not be stopped and succeeded." She paused again. She wrote, "I was not prepared for what it would feel like to watch something that cannot be stopped." She closed the journal. The station was beginning its morning cycle. The lighting on the research level shifted from night mode blue to the warmer tone of a day beginning. Somewhere 3 decks below, in a small and clean set of quarters that smelled of new materials, Maravos was asleep, and the standard 1-unit gravity was holding her gently and without effort, and she was going to wake up in a few hours and begin doing whatever came next. Dr. Sethal gathered her journals from the desk, both of them. She placed them in her bag. She took one last look around the office at the instrument cases and the data screens and the framed research awards on the wall, and she felt a settled kind of peace with all of it, the peace of someone who has completed something and is ready for what comes after. She left the office. She did not look back. In Mara's file, she had left one note in Breathian in her own script. The note was a sentence that did not translate with complete accuracy into standard because there was a Breathian concept at its center for which no other language had found a matching word. The closest the translation software could manage was something like, "She is healthy, she is ready for what she asked for, and she is not the kind of thing that should be studied in a room." The second sentence the translator had rendered as "recommend for field command." The third sentence it had flagged as requiring cultural context. The original Breathian reader roughly as the following: There are things in the universe that exist not to be measured, but to show you the size of what you thought you were measuring. I have found one. I am leaving her to her work. In 3 decks below, and 14 hours of clean, easy sleep, Maravos lay still, under the gentle weight of the world. She was not dreaming. She did not need to. She had already been to the places where the edge was supposed to be. She had found open ground instead. In the morning, she would keep walking.